This is a review of the 1965 John Gullerman film Rapture, which stars the late Dean Stockwell and the young Patricia Gozzi. It also has Peter Sallis in a minor role. Peter Sallis would go on to provide the voice of Gromit, as in Wallace and Gromit. No, just kidding. The voice of Wallace is the man. Sadly, in this role, he plays a Frenchman. It's a minor appearance, and he doesn't mention cheese a single time. Nonetheless, this is still an interesting movie. Despite not having a Wallace cameo, this is an interesting movie. It's not a surprise that it isn't a classic. This movie is tonally uneven and somewhat difficult to latch onto. It's somewhat unclear what genre this movie is, what it's doing, but it is definitely doing something, and I'll get to that. This movie has substance. It has meat. It has about 900 votes on IMDb with a rating of 7.2, and like I said, that's not totally surprising that it's not very widely seen or well-reviewed, but it has some definite virtues. We'll get into them. This movie I mainly picked out to watch because Dean Stockwell just passed away this week on November 7th of 2021, I believe. Dean Stockwell, phenomenal, legendary actor that I first saw in Long Day's Journey into Night, which is a phenomenal movie. For years was in my top 5, 10 movies of all time. Still an incredible movie. I can't think of... There are not many movies that have a stronger cast or a higher sort of level of acting across the board. An extremely mature film, an incredible adaptation of the Eugene O'Neill play. Can't recommend it enough. Long Day's Journey into Night. Dean Stockwell in that movie and throughout his entire career, his characters have a ferocious intensity, but also a profound intimacy. They are vulnerable. They're tormented. To some degree, maybe he's in the James Dean, Montgomery Clift category. He also looks a bit like both of those actors, in fact, but he was his own actor without a doubt. And besides being a distinct and a phenomenal actor, he also, you can catch some interviews with him on YouTube that are more interesting than the average talk with an actor. A lot of people know Dean Stockwell mainly from some of his later roles where he was kind of an older character actor. And it's a bit of a shame because he had a phenomenal career that actually started out with being a child actor, and perhaps some of the elements of a child actor, of being a child actor, some of those influences perhaps wore on his personality and his later characters. He's also in the movie Compulsion, which is a fantastic movie. The movie Paris, Texas as well. I'd recommend all three of those things. Of course, Long Day's Journey into Night being the first one. This movie also has a very young 15-year-old Patricia Gozzi in it. She's really the main character of this movie, and to some extent, this is a coming-of-age story about her. This is not anywhere near as vulnerable or as incisive as the coming-of-age story in the movie I reviewed last week, An Angel at My Table, that seems, has another level of humanism to it. This movie, decent movie, but the coming-of-age story is not anywhere near as personable, relatable, does not strike you as something that was made by somebody who had gone through that sort of situation, maybe to some extent. Interestingly, this movie is perhaps hopping on the somewhat fraught bandwagon of 1960s avant-garde sexualization of minors, where it was sort of the European thing was very young film stars for a period of time. For instance, in Romeo and Juliet, we had Olivia Hussey, very young woman. And this was, it was sort of a European thing, I guess, or it was marketed as such, was to have an extremely young girl in the film, and perhaps in some situations that is fitting with the storyline. Perhaps it is, perhaps it is realistic in some ways, but I'm not sure that people would be entirely on board with that today. But this definitely fits into that. So Patricia Gozzi, 15 years old, her coming-of-age story. To some extent, really, though, her age and the age of Dean Stockwell in this movie ends up being more confounding than anything, especially watching it now. It's kind of hard to figure out how old the characters are supposed to be in the movie, figure out exactly if they're being treated as children or as adults, and the answer is kind of both, but like I said, That's a bit of a dated perspective in some ways that makes the movie a little bit hard to access. In general, it's kind of unclear what this story is. Is it a coming of age story, a family drama? There are moments where it seems like a thriller, where there might be horror elements, some parts of the soundtrack early on, or some mysterious things that happen from time to time. But it's definitely not a thriller, and it kind of is a family story. It kind of is a coming of age story. It kind of is a family drama. Not much happens in the first half an hour of this movie, though, and it's a bit hard to get on board with the characters. They're not particularly compelling. Characters don't always, movies don't have to always have nice characters. You don't have to immediately be rooting for somebody necessarily. But in this movie, the characters just seem, I guess, a little bit kind of vague, hard to latch onto in the beginning. But this movie definitely has virtues, some that are clear from the start and some that become clear later on when you get deeper into the movie or when you start thinking about the movie a little bit more. So one of them clearly is the cinematography in this movie is quite good. Very well rendered film. The camera in this movie is extremely dynamic. We have surprisingly extensive tracking shots that seem like they might be from some new movie where you have some sort of fancy Steadicam or gimbal or something like that. Well, they're doing it in 1965 really well. There's a great sense of depth, partly because of this. Right, camera moving through a lot of different things. There's many parts of this movie that take place just in a house, but this does not feel like a play at all. And this is one place where it maybe departs from Long Day's Journey into Night, is that movie more or less is a play filmed in one house. It's somewhat static. This is not static at all, and despite having more or less the same locations for the entire movie, they really make the most out of it, and they really get a sense of depth, a sense of space. Maybe part of this is that the movie has tons of Dutch angles, tons of interesting camera angles, lots of things being tilted. It has harsh shadows, taking a nod from the noir, perhaps. This also, this movie was filmed with anamorphic lenses that have a really distinctive look in this film and have some pretty extreme warpage at times, so a very interesting look. You also have some cool aerial photography in this movie. The movie begins with some aerial photography, and you get some later on. You've got great locations. By the seaside, this movie is set in France, but clearly it is a British movie through and through. So, like I said, definitely a nicely rendered movie, and you'll notice that immediately. And as you get farther along, I think you start to understand more about what this movie's trying to do, and what there is to think about. Eventually, we do get some kind of a plot. I'm not going to go through it too much, but what I'll say is that basically the plot of this movie is that there's Dean Stockwell's character, Joseph is his name in the film, is some sort of escaped convict or criminal or something along those lines, and his original escape is witnessed by the main family in this movie. So this movie is Dean Stockwell's one character, then there's a family, which is Patricia Goetze is the daughter of the family. Her father is Melvin Douglas, by the way. I forgot to mention that, but he's in this movie, giving a pretty much standard Melvin Douglas role as a father who knows only how to be domineering. Perhaps is a loving father, but all he knows is how to be domineering or something like that. He's played this role many times, including in I Never Sang for My Father, phenomenal movie, which I reviewed on this channel a few months ago. Anyway, Agnes, that's Patricia Goetze's character's name, Agnes for Americans, Agnes. If you are slightly more cultured, I probably mispronounced that. Her family witnesses Joseph's original escape, and they end up taking him in. I won't say anything more than that about the movie. That doesn't give away much. When we start understanding the family dynamic of this, and particularly how Joseph interacts with it, we start to get to some of the more potent and interesting themes of the movie. We have, to some extent, a makeshift family. This reminds me, to a degree, of the film Shoplifters, incredible Hirokazu Koreeda movie, or the somewhat less subtle film Parasite, both of which have family units that are perhaps not exactly what they appear to be, where a certain sort of family unit is reconstructed by people who may, in some ways, have relationships that aren't exactly what you would expect. The makeshift family, interesting thing, and of course the makeshift family is perhaps to some degree a statement about a decay of the family unit or something like that, or maybe it's a metaphor for the family unit and a story about how individuals come together in tight spaces to live, through the intimate times of their life and such. One of the big questions of this movie is, why is each member of this family interested in this outsider, in Joseph? So Agnes first discovers Joseph in the back, and then Agnes's older sister, who's in the film, and Melvin Douglas, they're the father, they're all home. And for one reason or another, they all have some interest in him. I will also say that they do not immediately turn him in, at least, not to say they do later. Perhaps they do, perhaps they don't. But for at least some period of time, there is some mutual interest in this outsider, and it's for different reasons. There's a sheepish communion where Joseph is getting something out of them, but they are getting something out of him. Why is that? To some extent, it seems that they are all lonely. That's all that I will say about that. This is, I think, just a good cue for reading the movie to some extent. And again, this is, to some degree, a story about how we interact with other people, including our family, in our real life. Why are we interested? We have, perhaps, a sheepish communion, things that we need from each other, things that we don't entirely want to admit that we need, but that are somewhat transparent anyway. On the other hand, Joseph, at one point in the movie, apologizes to Agnes. What for? Well, for not being who she thought he was. You'll have to see the movie to understand the exact context of that, but apologizes for not being the person that she thought he was. And this is another part of this. We have a sheepish communion. We have things that we are transparently counting on each other for, to some degree. And it kind of works and it kind of doesn't work. The makeshift family serves needs, but at the same time, it's makeshift. It's individuals on their own journeys who don't quite get their needs met and who may come together for a time in life. The tracks may run parallel, but they may diverge again later. So I think that is some of the meat of the movie, this understanding of the intersection of different people's lives or whatever, understanding the intimacy, but also the alienation within a family. There's also a moral component to the film, right? So Joseph is on the run. There's this conflict with the law, and the members of the family, in deciding whether or not they should support him, have some moral thinking to do. And they each have their own ways of processing this. You see this in the film, how all three characters kind of contextualize this in a different way. It's most clearly stated with Melvin Douglas's character, the father. And I won't go into this in depth, but suffice to say, Melvin Douglas, his character, has an interesting background with morality. And while you might expect him to have the most sort of mature moral process, he has a lot to think about, and to some extent, there is some sort of moral crisis. There are also some interesting mental health themes in this movie. Agnes's character is to some extent implied to be abnormal or something like that. Then maybe it's implied that, in fact, she is normal, but her father is telling her she's abnormal or something like that. These, I think, are one of the weaker points of the movie, not because it's dated or anything, although these ideas are kind of dated, but really just because this whole angle is quite vague in the film. It's not exactly clear. It's not exactly clear what the conclusion is. Why is the movie called Rapture? This is an interesting question that I think helps crystallize the vibe of the movie as well as some of the intellectual ideas behind it. A rapture is, the revelation of true characters, the separation of the good from the evil or something like that. And in this film, we do, to some degree, have some of that. We have some of that through self-realization. We have Joseph's apology, like I mentioned. He apologizes for not being who she thought he was, so some revelation of true character. We also have a coming-of-age plot, which, like I said, self-realization, revelation of true character, those are linked to coming of age. And perhaps the film is likening this coming-of-age story to some kind of rapture. And that's kind of a weird way to think about things, because surely the coming of age should be a bright time. Surely it should be exciting or something like that. But maybe you could say also there's some death of innocence. I don't really like that phrase, but there's some death of innocence, some loss of innocence that is connected with understanding the true nature of the world, the true nature of people. I think likening coming of age to the rapture does kind of capture the downtrodden, somewhat macabre vibe of this film to some extent. This is not a coming of age story like say anything or something like this. It's not some sort of 80s movie about buckling up for life's big adventure. It is much more macabre, much more downtrodden in some ways. And so maybe that is a bit like The Rapture. Now, on the other hand, a rapture is supposed to be revealing. It's supposed to decisively separate the sinners and the saints, the good and the bad. And this movie absolutely does not do that. And in fact, the main virtue of this film is that it doesn't do that, is that things in the film end up being fairly complex. The movie picks up steam with about 20 minutes to go as things start to get a little bit more complicated, as allegiances become blurry, as the right thing to do becomes less and less clear, as your allegiances between characters shift, and as their motivations are revealed to some degree, and as they evolve. There's compelling turmoil in the film and provocative uncertainty. And this, like I said, is the crux of the film. This is the best part of the movie. And it isn't at all like a rapture. There's no absolution, edification. There's no clarity. There's no, oh, it's revealed that one character turns out to be the good guy, and another character turns out to be the bad guy. Absolutely not. And so in some ways, it seems like the title Rapture is almost in jest. Or the comment that's being made here is that, in fact, in the real world, there is not some obvious rapture where some are pulled up to heaven and some are left on, I forget how this works exactly, they're left on Earth and then Earth catches fire or something along those lines. That's not how things go in the real life, and that, in fact, your journey of self-realization, your coming-of-age story, your rekindling your relationship with your family, your relation to your family as an adult, and such, those things are not decisive, rapturous events. They are, in fact, somewhat confounding and confusing things, and perhaps that is the true nature of the rapture, or something along those lines. Okay. Last thing is that this movie has kind of an interesting beginning. It starts with a wedding between Agnes's oldest sister and Peter Salas, Wallace, and there's an interesting scene here where one of Agnes's sort of step brothers, I guess, someone who's going to be a future in-law, is young man tries to kiss Agnes, and she runs away, and then the boy comes after her and tries to make her dance with him on the dance floor, and she kind of runs away again, runs out into the street, is almost hit by a car. Kind of a traumatic beginning with this start. And it's an interesting way to set the table for the movie. It's an interesting way to contextualize Agnes. Like I said, there is some undercurrent of her being abnormal, or her being an outsider to some degree, but this beginning hints at her vulnerability. It hints at her being in a compromised, disempowered position. It hints at some political undercurrents in the film, and like I said, those undercurrents are maybe carried forth in the incomplete thoughts on mental health. But this isn't really a political movie, and those threads aren't really carried through. This is not something that I have a firm conclusion on yet, is why the film begins exactly like this, or what the goal is in setting up the movie that way is. If you removed the first 10 minutes of the film, if you removed the wedding scene at the beginning, if you removed the older sister and Peter Salas' character entirely, would the movie be the same? Mostly, it seems like it would. And yet, there is this sort of significant moment at the beginning. So that's something to think about if you end up watching this movie, or if you've already seen it. Like I said, clearly this movie has some meat to it. You know, it takes a little while to get going. It is a little bit all over the place in terms of genre and tone, but there are some complex themes in this movie, and it does get going. There's some good acting. There's some nice cinematography, and overall, a pretty good movie. Dean Stockwell's role in it is pretty much par for the course with a lot of the characters he played. Really a fairly compelling character who has intensity, but also vulnerability and such. So that is Rapture, which, like I said, it's an okay movie. I think worth watching, but not a movie to go into necessarily with just a complete blank slate, something to have a little bit of a heads up on what some of the ideas and themes might be.